Take your things and get out!
Give it now!
That's where you belong.
Neighbors gathered, waiting for tears, but she just straightened her coat and smiled softly, because the Rolls-Royce turning the corner changed everything. The Saturday sun hung high and golden over Albright Street, the kind of afternoon where children chased each other down driveways and old women sat on porches with glasses of sweet tea balanced on their knees. It was a good street, a quiet street, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, but held it behind smiles, until the day they couldn't hold it anymore. Damon Hightower stood in the middle of his driveway with his chest pushed forward and his jaw set tight, like a man who had rehearsed this moment in the mirror and decided the whole world owed him the stage. Behind him, parked at an angle that swallowed half the walkway, sat his black Escalade. The passenger door hung open, and inside, a woman named Keisha reclined with her legs crossed, one arm draped out the window, gold nails catching the sunlight. She wasn't hiding, she wasn't whispering. She was watching the scene unfold like it had been arranged for her entertainment. And at the curb, stacked beside the city trash bin, like they didn't carry a single memory worth keeping, sat 2 suitcases and 3 black garbage bags. Everything Celeste Hightower owned that still fit inside the home she had called hers for 7 years. Damon pointed at the pile. Then he pointed at his wife. "Right there," he said, loud enough to bounce off every front porch on the block. "That's where you belong, next to the trash, you and everything you came with." Keisha laughed from the car. Not a nervous laugh, not a small one. A full, deliberate sound that traveled down the street like she wanted every set of curtains on Albright to pull back and watch. And they did. Mrs. Coleman froze on her porch with her watering can still tilted. The Jefferson twins dropped their jump rope in the middle of the sidewalk. Mr. Avery lowered his newspaper and didn't pick it back up. A screen door somewhere down the block creaked open and stayed open. Then the front door of the house swung wide. One last time. Vivian Hightower, Damon's mother, stepped out onto the porch carrying a worn leather tote bag, the kind with a cracked spine and soft corners that only comes from years of being held. Inside that bag sat Celeste's journal. Old, heavy, filled with handwriting that wasn't hers, pages her grandmother had written long before Celeste was born. Vivian walked down the 3 porch steps with the posture of a woman who had waited years for this afternoon. She crossed the driveway without looking at Celeste, dropped the bag on top of the suitcase pile, and the journal slid halfway out, its leather cover catching the sun. Then Vivian turned toward the Escalade, smiled at Keisha, and said it loud enough for the whole block to hear. "Welcome home, sweetheart." 3 of them now. Damon in the driveway, Keisha in the car, Vivian on the steps, all facing the same direction, like a wall built to push one woman into the street. And on the other side of that wall, alone, standing next to a trash bin with the sun falling across her shoulders, stood Celeste. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not reach for her bags or look at the neighbors for help. She stood with both hands at her sides, her back straight, her chin level. She looked at each of them, one at a time, slowly, the way a woman looks at people she has already finished mourning. Then she did something nobody on that street expected. She bent down, picked up the journal from the pile, dusted the cover with the heel of her palm, and tucked it under her arm. She straightened her coat, adjusted the collar, and let the silence stretch until every soul on that block could feel it pressing against their chest. Damon shifted his weight. He wasn't expecting quiet. He was expecting tears, screaming, maybe a scene he could point to later and say, "See, that's why I had to do it. That's why she had to go." But Celeste gave him nothing. and that nothing sat in his stomach heavier than any word she could have spoken. Then she smiled, soft, small, the kind of smile that doesn't come from happiness. It comes from knowing something the rest of the room hasn't figured out yet. And at the far end of Albright Street, a black Rolls-Royce turned the corner. It moved slowly, deliberately, its engine a whisper underneath the silence, sunlight sliding across the hood like oil on dark water. Every head on the block turned, every mouth went still. The car didn't speed up, it didn't slow down. It glided toward the house with the patience of something that had been coming for a very long time and was in no hurry to explain itself. Damon looked at the car. Then he looked at Celeste. Her smile had not changed. And for the first time since he dragged that suitcase to the curb, something cold and unfamiliar moved through his chest. Not guilt, not shame, but the sudden understanding that he had missed something. Something important. Something he couldn't take back. Every person on that sidewalk believed they were watching a woman hit rock bottom. Not a single soul understood they were watching a woman who had already been caught by hands they couldn't see. 7 years before that Saturday, Damon Hightower walked into a hair salon on Brewster Avenue looking for directions to an auto shop 2 blocks east. He never found the shop, but he found Celeste. She was sitting in the 3rd chair from the window, reading a paperback with one hand and holding a comb in the other while her client's color set. When she looked up and smiled, it was the kind of smile that didn't ask for anything, and that was the thing that made him stay. They dated for 14 months, married in a small ceremony on the grounds of grandmother Lorraine May's property. A wide, quiet estate outside the city, past a white gate and a gravel drive lined with pecan trees older than anyone living. Lorraine May had stood at the front of the aisle that day, with her shoulders square and her eyes soft. Before the vows, she pressed a leather-bound journal into Celeste's hands. The leather was old, but oiled, the spine cracked from decades of opening and closing. "This journal has been in our family longer than that house you're moving into," Lorraine May had said, closing Celeste's fingers around it. "I've written things in the back pages you don't need to read yet, but keep it close. One day, baby, that book is going to speak for you when nobody else will." Celeste kept it on her nightstand from that day forward. She wrote in it the way her grandmother taught her. Small things, daily things, the kind of details that seem ordinary until you need to remember exactly how your life used to feel. The first years on Albright Street were good. Damon brought her coffee before she opened her eyes. He'd leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror. "You're still the prettiest thing on this street," and she'd find them and press them into the journal between her own pages. They tried for a baby once. It didn't take. But the house stayed full of warm dinners and quiet hope and the feeling that they were building something worth protecting. Then Damon got promoted at the freight company, operations manager. The title came with longer hours, a company car, and a circle of new associates whose names Celeste didn't recognize. He started coming home later. His phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter, started living face down in his jacket pocket. And Vivian started coming around. Sunday dinners at Vivian's house became required. Vivian would sit at the head of her table and hold court, her voice warm enough to sound like advice, but sharp enough to cut. "A man in Damon's position needs a woman who matches his trajectory," she'd say, setting her fork down for emphasis. "A woman with presence, with connections, with something more than a salon chair." She never said Celeste's name during those speeches. She didn't have to. The meaning hung in the air like smoke nobody wanted to breathe in. Damon laughed at his mother's words. Sometimes he nodded. Once, during one of Vivian's monologues, Celeste caught him glancing at her across the table. The look in his eyes was not guilt, it was agreement. And that was the moment Celeste felt the floor shift beneath her. Not all at once, but slowly, the way a house settles on a cracking foundation. She noticed everything after that. The second phone in his gym bag, the cologne he wore that she never bought, the receipts from restaurants she'd never been to, tucked inside jacket pockets he thought she never checked, the way he'd shower the moment he walked in the door at midnight, even though he said he'd been at the office working late. She didn't confront him. She didn't cry into her pillow or call her girlfriends. She filed every detail into the quiet place behind her eyes where certainty gathers before it speaks. Because Celeste had learned something from Lorraine May a long time ago, that silence is not the absence of strength. It is the place where strength decides what to do next. And one night, sitting alone in the bedroom while Damon laughed on the phone downstairs, she opened the journal and turned to the back pages, the ones written in Lorraine May's careful hand. She saw numbers, legal phrases, a notarized stamp, a name she recognized as her own, printed in ink that had faded but never disappeared. She didn't understand everything she read, but she felt the weight of it, and she closed the journal slowly and held it against her chest. Something was hidden inside that book, something Lorraine May had planted years before, like a seed buried deep enough to survive any storm. And whatever it was waiting. The truth found Celeste on a Tuesday. Not a special day, not a day anyone would remember for any reason except what happened inside it. The sky was overcast. Leftover chicken sat wrapped in foil on the second shelf of the fridge. Damon was in the shower, singing a song he'd never sung in that house before, and his second phone sat face up on the bathroom counter, the screen still glowing from a notification he hadn't closed. Celeste didn't plan to look. She walked in to grab her lotion from the top shelf, and the screen was right there, wide open, as if the truth had gotten tired of waiting to be found. The messages filled the screen in a thread that scrolled back months. Keisha's name at the top. Photos Celeste didn't let her eyes stay on, and then the words that stopped her hand mid-reach. "When do I get to move in for real, baby?" Keisha had written. Damon's reply sat right beneath it. "Soon as I get her out. My mama's already working on it. 2 more weeks." Celeste's fingers tightened around the lotion bottle until her knuckles went pale. She didn't breathe. She scrolled. And then she found the group chat. 3 names, Damon, Keisha, Vivian, 217 messages, every single one about her. Vivian had written, "That girl came from nothing, and she'll go back to nothing. No family money, no connections, no leverage. She'll leave quiet because she can't afford to make noise." Keisha had sent a row of laughing emojis. Damon had typed one word. Facts. The water in the shower shut off. Celeste set the phone down exactly where it had been. Same angle, same direction, screen still glowing, and walked out of the bathroom without making a sound. She sat on the edge of the bed, placed both hands flat on her knees, and breathed. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not pick up the nearest object and throw it against the wall. Her body was still, but her mind was moving, fast, sharp, clear, turning every piece over like glass held up to light. She reached for the journal on the nightstand and pressed her thumb against the inner spine, feeling the pages at the back where Lorraine May's handwriting lived. She opened to those pages again. This time, she read slower. She saw a trust reference number, a legal description of a parcel of land, a deed transfer dated years before she was born, and her name, Celeste Ann Morrow, her maiden name, printed 3 separate times across 3 separate documents pasted into the back cover. She sat with the journal open on her lap for 9 minutes. Then she picked up her own phone and called the only person in her life she had never once doubted. "Grandma," she said. Her voice did not shake. "I need to tell you everything." She told Lorraine May about the phone, the messages, the group chat, the plan to push her out. When she finished, the line went quiet for a long time. Celeste could hear Lorraine May breathing, slow, steady, the sound of a woman who had been waiting for this call longer than Celeste knew. Then Lorraine May spoke, and her voice carried a weight that made the walls feel closer. "Baby, bring me that journal. It's time I showed you what your name is really worth." Celeste hung up. She placed the phone on the nightstand, closed the journal, and lay on top of the covers with her eyes open. Damon walked out of the bathroom, climbed into bed beside her, and fell asleep without saying goodnight. She stared at the ceiling until the room turned blue with early morning light. Not because she was broken, but because she was building something in her mind, turning every detail over, deciding which stones to set in place and which ones to throw. And the question that sat at the center of everything, the one she could not yet answer, was this: what had her grandmother buried inside that journal all those years ago? And why had she waited until now to say it was time to look? The following Saturday, Celeste drove 40 minutes outside the city, past the last strip mall, past the churches and the car lots and the neighborhoods that thinned out into farmland. She turned onto a road she hadn't driven in over a year and followed it until the white gate appeared between 2 old stone pillars wrapped in ivy. She pressed the intercom. The gate swung open without a word. The gravel driveway stretched a 1/4 mile between rows of pecan trees whose branches arched overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. At the end of it, Lorraine May's house rose from the green. A wide 2-story home with sage-colored shutters, a wraparound porch, and flower beds so deep with color they looked painted on. Behind the house, stretching beyond the garden and the old barn and the guest cottage with the copper roof, lay 12 acres of land that had been in the family for 3 generations. This was not a retirement home. This was not a comfortable old woman's house. This was quiet, generational, deliberately hidden wealth. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that waits. Lorraine May sat at the kitchen table, with a glass of water and a manila folder thick enough to stand on its own. The journal lay between them. She didn't offer pleasantries. She opened the journal to the back pages and placed her finger on the notarized stamp Celeste had seen but never understood. "This," Lorraine May said, "is a trust document. Your grandfather and I purchased the land that your house sits on, the lot on Albright Street, 41 years ago. We placed it in a family trust in your name before you were born. The deed to that land has never been transferred. It has never been sold. It belongs to you. It has always belonged to you." Celeste stared at the page. The words blurred and then sharpened. "The house Damon built on that lot," Lorraine May continued, "was paid for with the gift I gave you both for your wedding. That was my money. And the land underneath it, that is your inheritance. He refinanced that property 6 months ago, forged your signature on the documents, and put everything in his name. But a man cannot refinance land he does not own. And he does not own that land. You do." Lorraine May slid the manila folder across the table. Inside, the original trust deed, a certified copy of the land survey, a letter from the family attorney confirming Celeste as sole beneficiary, and printed screenshots, Celeste's screenshots, of the group chat between Damon, Keisha, and Vivian. "I never told you about the trust," Lorraine May said, "because I wanted your marriage to be built on love, not leverage. I wanted you to be chosen because of who you are, not what you own." She paused. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were not. "But love left that house a long time ago, baby. So now the paper speaks." That afternoon, Celeste and Lorraine May sat with the family attorney in the study. Documents were reviewed, legal letters were drafted, a timeline was drawn. Celeste asked no questions she didn't already know the answer to. She signed where she needed to sign, and stood when the meeting was over, and walked to the car with the journal under her arm, and a stillness in her body that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with purpose. Meanwhile, back on Albright Street, Damon was getting bolder. He brought Keisha to Mr. Avery's neighborhood barbecue like she had always been there. Keisha wore a white sundress and gold earrings and walked through the yard like she was auditioning for a role she had already been promised. Vivian arrived 20 minutes later. She walked straight to the grill, placed her hand on Damon's shoulder, and introduced Keisha to a circle of neighbors. "This is Damon's new chapter. I think y'all are going to love her." Nobody said a word. Mrs. Coleman picked up her plate and moved to the other side of the yard. The Jefferson twins' mother pulled her daughters closer. Mr. Avery flipped a burger and did not look up, and then Vivian saw Celeste. She was standing near the fence, alone, holding a paper plate with potato salad she hadn't touched. The sun was behind her, and she looked small against the yard full of people who wouldn't meet her eyes. Vivian walked over slowly, smoothing the front of her dress, and stopped close enough that Celeste could smell her perfume. She tilted her head and spoke just loud enough for the circle of women nearby to hear, the kind of volume that pretends to be private, but is designed to wound publicly. "Sweetheart," Vivian said, "if I were you, I'd start packing now. Save yourself the embarrassment of being told twice, because the next time won't be as gentle as the first." The women nearby froze. One of them looked at her shoes. Another pressed her lips together and turned away. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended Celeste. The silence itself was a second humiliation, the kind that comes not from what is said, but from what everyone else chooses not to say. Celeste looked at Vivian. She held the journal tucked inside her tote bag at her side. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She just said, "Not yet," and walked to the gate and let herself out. A neighbor leaned toward Mrs. Coleman and whispered, "That woman has completely given up. She's not even going to fight." But that neighbor didn't know what was inside the tote bag. She didn't know what was inside the journal. She didn't know what had already been signed, what had already been filed, what was already in motion beneath the surface of every quiet step Celeste had taken for the past 2 weeks. And the truth of it was this: Celeste wasn't the one who should have been afraid. She was the only one in that yard who knew exactly how this story was going to end. And she was the only one who wasn't in a rush to get there. 2 weeks later, the invitations went out for Deacon Wardle's annual Community Appreciation Banquet at Greater Hope Fellowship Hall. White tablecloths, printed programs. The whole neighborhood dressed in their Sunday best on a Saturday evening, gathered under fluorescent lights and hanging streamers, with a buffet line that stretched from the kitchen to the double doors. Damon arrived in a charcoal suit with Keisha on his arm. She wore red, a dress that fit like it had been chosen for the purpose of being remembered. Vivian walked in behind them, navy blue, pearls, chin high, greeting people at the door like she had organized the event herself. Celeste arrived alone. She wore a simple, cream-colored dress. No jewelry except a thin chain around her neck. Her hair was pulled back. She carried a small clutch purse in one hand and a canvas tote bag in the other. Inside the tote, tucked flat against a folder of printed documents, sat the journal. She greeted people at her table. She shook hands. She smiled. She asked Mrs. Coleman about her garden and complimented Mr. Avery on his tie. She moved through the room the way a river moves through stone, without force, without hurry, without the slightest indication that anything beneath the surface was different from what appeared above it. But something was different. People noticed. The woman they expected to see broken was not broken. The woman they expected to see hiding in a corner or staying home was standing in the center of the room with a calm so deep it unsettled every person who looked at her for longer than 3 seconds. Her eyes were clear. Her posture was straight. She looked like a woman who had already lived through the worst thing and come out carrying something the rest of the room couldn't see. Damon saw her from across the hall. He set down his glass of punch and leaned toward Keisha. "Why is she even here?" Keisha rolled her eyes and looped her arm through his. "Who cares?" she said. "Let her watch." She ran her fingers along Damon's lapel and laughed. The same laugh from the Escalade, the same sound she made on that sidewalk. And it carried across the room like a dare. But Vivian didn't laugh. She stood 2 tables away with a plate of food she hadn't touched, watching Celeste move through the room. Her lips pressed together. Her left hand gripped the back of a chair. She turned to Damon and said quietly, "Something's not right. That woman looks too settled for someone who just got put out of her own house." Damon shrugged. "She's bluffing. She's got nowhere to go and nothing to fight with. Let her sit there and pretend she's fine." But Vivian's eyes followed Celeste across the room. She watched her stop at the tech table near the projector. She watched her plug a laptop into the screen mounted on the wall. She watched the screen flicker blue and then go dark. And she watched Celeste nod to herself, one small nod, the kind a person makes when the last piece of something has clicked into place, and return to her seat. Vivian set her plate down. She didn't eat again for the rest of the evening. Nobody questioned it. Volunteers handled tech setup every year, but Vivian's fingers tightened around her glass, and she didn't drink from it again. Deacon Wardell stepped to the podium. He welcomed the congregation. He blessed the food. He acknowledged the choir. He told a story about his late wife that made half the room cry and the other half laugh. And then he paused. He looked at the room for a long moment, his hands resting on either side of the lectern, and his voice dropped half a register. "Before we close this evening," he said, "a member of our community has asked to share something with this room. I have personally reviewed what she's prepared, and I believe, with my whole heart, that every person sitting in this hall tonight needs to hear it." 200 people sat in that room, thinking they were there for dinner and a speech. Only one woman knew what was really loaded on that screen. Celeste stood. The chair didn't scrape. She rose the way water rises. Slowly, without resistance, without sound. She picked up the canvas tote, walked to the front of the hall and set the bag on the edge of the podium. Then she faced the room. 200 faces looked back at her, some curious, some confused, a few already leaning toward their neighbors to whisper. Damon sat 4 tables from the front with Keisha on his left and Vivian on his right. His jaw tightened. His hand dropped from the table to his knee. Celeste did not raise her voice. She did not rush. She spoke the way her grandmother spoke, low, clear, and final. 8 days ago, she began, my husband dragged my suitcase to the curb and dropped it next to the trash bin in front of our home on Albright Street. He told me, in front of every neighbor on that block, that the trash is where I belong. She paused. His girlfriend sat in the car and laughed. His mother walked out of the house carrying my personal things in a garbage bag and dropped them on the pile. And then she turned to the girlfriend and said, "Welcome home, sweetheart." The room was still, not quiet, still, the kind of silence that presses against the walls. Not one person on that street said a word. She let the sentence sit. She watched it land on every face in the first 3 rows and spread backward like a ripple. Then she reached into the tote bag and pulled out a printed stack of pages. She turned toward the projector screen and pressed a button on the laptop. The first screenshot filled the wall. A text message. Damon's name at the top, Keisha's name below. The words were large enough for the last row to read, "When do I get to move in for real, baby?" And Damon's reply, "Soon as I get her out. My mama's already working on it." The room gasped, not one gasp, a wave of them rolling from front to back like a tide pulling people under. Celeste pressed the button again. The next slide showed the group chat. 3 names, Damon, Keisha, Vivian. Vivian's message filled the center of the screen. "That girl came from nothing and she'll go back to nothing. No money, no connections, no leverage. She'll leave quiet because she can't afford to make noise." Vivian shot to her feet. Her chair flew backward into the legs of the person behind her. "Turn that off," she hissed. "Turn it off right now." Celeste did not look at her. She did not pause. She pressed the button again. The next slide was a mortgage document. Damon's name at the top. A signature at the bottom that read Celeste Hightower, but the handwriting was not Celeste's. She let the room look at it. She let them study the letters. Then she said calmly, "This is a refinance document my husband filed 6 months ago. He forged my signature to transfer our home entirely into his name. He thought that was the end of it." She reached into the tote bag again. This time, she pulled out the journal. The old leather one with the cracked spine. The one Vivian had tossed onto the trash pile 8 days earlier. She held it up, and the room recognized it. Some of them had seen it on that sidewalk, lying in the dirt next to the garbage bags. Celeste opened the journal to the back pages and held it toward the light. Her voice did not waver. "My grandmother, Lorraine May Morrow, gave me this journal on my wedding day. Inside the back cover, she placed 3 documents. The first is an original deed of trust. The second is a land survey. The third is a notarized letter from our family attorney confirming that the land, the lot on Albright Street, the ground that house is built on, has been held in a family trust in my name since before I was born." She lowered the journal and looked at Damon for the first time. The room held its breath. 200 people leaned forward in their chairs without knowing they had moved. "You told me I belonged next to the trash," she said. "You stood in that driveway and said it in front of children, in front of elders, in front of people who watched me walk to that curb and said nothing." She paused. Let the words land on every conscience in the room. "But you've been living on my land, in a house my family's money built, with my name underneath every wall, every floor, every room you tried to give away to someone else. You didn't throw away a woman with nothing. You threw away the woman who owned the ground you were standing on." Damon's mouth opened. No sound came out. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned gray. Keisha's smile had disappeared 3 slides ago. She reached for her purse under the table. Her heel caught the chair leg, and the sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. She stood and tried to move toward the aisle, but Mrs. Coleman was already standing in it, not blocking it, just standing there. Arms folded, looking at Keisha the way you look at someone who has finally run out of places to hide. Vivian sat down. Not slowly. She dropped, like her legs had simply decided they were done holding her up. Her pearls swung forward and rested against the tablecloth, and she stared at the journal in her daughter-in-law's hand, the same journal she had tossed into the dirt like it meant nothing. Then the side door of the fellowship hall opened. Grandmother Lorraine May stepped through. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. She wore a long navy coat buttoned to the collar and a single strand of pearls that caught the overhead light with each step. Her shoes clicked on the tile floor with a rhythm that silenced every whisper in the room. She was 81 years old, and she walked like a woman who had spent every one of those years deciding exactly how to carry herself. Not for anyone else's benefit, but because dignity was a language she had spoken since before most people in that room were born. Behind her, through the open door, the black Rolls-Royce sat in the church parking lot, its headlights still glowing in the evening air. Lorraine May did not speak. She walked to the front of the hall, stood beside Celeste, and placed one hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. That was all. One hand, one touch. And the room understood everything that hand said. I am here. I have always been here. And I brought the proof. Celeste closed the journal. She tucked it under her arm the same way she had on that sidewalk 8 days earlier. Slowly, deliberately, like a woman returning a weapon to its sheath. She looked at the room. She did not smile. She did not cry. She nodded once, to Deacon Wardle, to Mrs. Coleman, to the faces that had been watching her all along, and walked back to her seat without looking at Damon once. The room did not erupt. It didn't need to. The silence after truth has been spoken is louder than any standing ovation. A few people cried. A few people clapped softly, like they were afraid the sound might break something. Deacon Wardell stepped back to the podium, placed both hands on the wood, and said quietly, "Let us all go home tonight and think carefully about what kind of people we want to be." And Damon sat in his chair, surrounded by 200 people who now knew exactly who he was, with his mother's head in her hands beside him and his girlfriend's empty seat still warm. The legal papers arrived at the house on Albright Street 4 days later. A courier knocked on the door at 9 in the morning. Damon opened it in a bathrobe, expecting a package. He got a manila envelope with his name on it and the return address of a law firm he had never heard of. Inside, a notice of trust enforcement, a demand to vacate the property within 30 days, a cease and desist regarding the fraudulent refinance, and a copy of the original deed, the one from the journal, with Celeste's maiden name circled in red ink by the attorney. Damon called Keisha. The number was disconnected. He called again from the house phone. It rang 6 times and went to a voicemail box that had been cleared. He drove to her apartment that afternoon and found the parking spot where her car used to be empty. The blinds were drawn. The mailbox was overflowing. Keisha was gone, not just from his life, but from the city. She had vanished the way people vanish when the thing they were chasing turns out to be built on someone else's ground. Vivian tried to spin the story. She called her sister first, the one who always took her side, the one who had nodded along at every Sunday dinner when Vivian said Celeste wasn't good enough. But her sister had been at the banquet. She had seen the screenshots projected 10 feet tall on a church wall. She had watched Vivian's own words, typed with her own thumbs, sent from her own phone, displayed for 200 people to read in silence. "You did this to yourself, Viv," her sister said, "and you did it in writing. I don't know what you want me to say." Vivian called the women from her Bible study group. She called 2 cousins and a neighbor from her own street. Every call went the same way. A pause, a careful breath, and then a voice that was polite but finished. "Vivian, I saw what you wrote. I don't think I'm the right person to talk to about this. One by one, the doors closed. Not with anger, with something worse. The quiet withdrawal of people who no longer trust you enough to sit across a table from you. Damon drove to Lorraine May's estate 3 days before his deadline. He buzzed the intercom at the white gate and waited. The housekeeper's voice came through, calm and unhurried. "Mrs. Lorraine May asked me to tell you that you had your chance to be a husband. That chance is finished. Please don't come back to this gate." The intercom clicked off. The gate did not open. Damon sat in his car for 12 minutes, staring at the white pillars and the pecan trees beyond them. And then he drove back to Albright Street to finish packing. On the last day, he loaded his boxes into a rented truck alone. No one helped him. No one came out of their house to say goodbye. He carried his clothes, his shoes, his flat screen, his weights, and a framed photo of himself that used to hang in the hallway. He made 14 trips between the front door and the truck bed. On the 9th trip, he looked up and saw Mr. Avery standing on his porch across the street. The same porch, the same spot where Mr. Avery had stood the day Damon dragged Celeste's suitcase to the curb. Mr. Avery looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned around, walked inside his house, and closed the door. The keys sat on the porch railing. 2 sets, one Damon's, one that Vivian had given to Keisha at the barbecue, returned and useless, sitting side by side on the wood like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to read. Damon climbed into the cab of the truck. He sat behind the wheel and looked at the house one last time. The garden Celeste had planted along the front walkway was still blooming. The curtains she had chosen were still hanging in the windows. The porch light she always left on was dark. He dropped his forehead against the steering wheel and the street was quiet around him. The kind of quiet that doesn't comfort. The kind that reminds a man exactly what he threw away and exactly how many people watched him do it. 3 months later, the light on Albright Street looked different. Or maybe it was the same light it had always been, just falling on a different story now. Celeste sat on the porch of a small cottage at the far end of Lorraine May's property, a place of her own. The roof was tin, and the porch was painted white, and along the side of the house ran a vegetable garden she had planted with her own hands, tomatoes and basil, and collard greens pushing up through the dark soil like small green promises. Wind chimes hung from the eave. A glass of sweet tea sat on the arm of the rocking chair, and on the small table beside her, open to a page near the middle, sat the journal. Not as evidence anymore, not as a weapon, just as a record. A reminder of where she came from and who had loved her long before she knew she needed it. Lorraine May came through the screen door carrying a second glass and sat in the chair beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. The wind chimes turned once and went still. A bird landed on the garden fence and tilted its head like it was listening. Then Lorraine May said, "You didn't need the money, baby. You didn't even need the land. You just needed to remember who you were before he made you forget." Celeste looked at her grandmother, and for the first time in this whole story, the first time since that sidewalk, since that phone, since that banquet hall, she smiled. Not a careful smile, not a knowing smile, a real one. The kind that starts behind the eyes and reaches the mouth last. The kind that doesn't need a reason and doesn't owe an explanation. She reached over and placed her hand on top of Lorraine May's. 2 hands, 2 women, 3 generations of strength sitting on a porch they had earned with patience and truth, and the refusal to become the kind of people who hurt them. The journal lay open in the late afternoon light, its pages catching the gold of a sun that was finally going down. Easy. The garden was growing. The wind chimes sang one long, soft note that hung in the air like a prayer answered late, but answered right. And Celeste sat there, on her own porch, in her own peace, with her name under her feet and her story held in her own hands, breathing the kind of air that only reaches you after you've walked through every room that tried to keep you small. She never screamed. She never cursed his name. She never begged for what was already hers. She just waited, quietly, patiently, until the truth had no more room to hide. And when it finally came out, it didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be true. If this story reminded you that dignity is its own kind of power, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because the next story is already waiting for you. Stay blessed until next time.